Welcome to the 2023 Nebraska Chautauqua. Joining us for What Connects Us, presented by Humanities Nebraska and our community partners here in Grand Island. Many people have helped to bring What Connects Us Chautauqua to Grand Island, and many thanks are in order. The Nebraska Chautauqua is presented by Humanities Nebraska with support from Stuhr Museum, the Grand Island Public Library, the Johnny Carson Fund at the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, the Greater Grand Island Community Foundation, Hall County Historical Society, Grand Island Tourism, Stuhr Museum Foundation, Grand Island Area Economic Development Corporation, Kim and Tom Dinsdale, K. Fowles, State of Nebraska, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the contributions of many other generous businesses, organizations, and individuals that are listed on the inside front cover of your program. Let's give them a round of applause. Also, let's welcome Chris Sumrich. Chris is running right there. He is right there from Humanities Nebraska. Also, Christy Hayek, Carly, Heather Thomas, Erica Hamilton, Liz Mikowski, and Sherry Lynn Hansen, Marcy Thomas, Katie Bradshaw, also from the Humanities Nebraska staff. Also, Karen Higgins, Dory Winiska, Keith Bystrom, Garcila Canero Livingston from the Humanities Nebraska Board, and Leanna Steele, Kim Dinsdale, Taylor Green, Kent Warnicki, Lynette Krieger, also of the Humanities Nebraska Board alumni. Welcome to them. Also, Chuck Shoemaker from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment Board, along with Leanna Steele, her husband and mayor of Grand Island, Roger Steele. I've seen Roger running around here somewhere. Also, City Councilman Mitch Nickerson and his wife Susan from Grand Island are here. Wanted to acknowledge our electeds that are here. Hopefully I didn't overlook any others. That's who I happen to notice coming in. All right. Okay, a couple of things. Housekeeping again. We want to enjoy the evening, so please take a moment to put your cell phones and other devices on silent. And please note that the Chautauqua programs are a smoke-free environment. Also, flash photography is not allowed. Restroom facilities, as I described earlier, are down Front Street in the yellow building on the south side, just around the corner there. For those of you who are new to first-person style presentations, let me explain how the evening will proceed. I'll introduce our first guest for the evening, Mrs. Rosa Parks, here just momentarily, and she will tell you about herself. Then you'll have the opportunity to ask Mrs. Parks questions about her life and views. Following the question and answer period with our first historical figure, we will take a short intermission before we get with our second guest for the evening, Chief Standing Bear. At the end of the evening, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of the modern-day scholars who portrayed our characters. So it's an opportunity for you to think of them in character and ask those questions about their ideas and thoughts related to that. And then, of course, the interpretation of those will be later on this evening. At this time, I would like to introduce our first featured speaker. Our first speaker this evening is a well-known due to a particular day in history. She grew up in Alabama and will give you more insight into pivotal moments she experienced. Please welcome Rosa Parks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your being here to listen to my story, and I am always grateful for any opportunity to set the record straight. You see, it's barely 20 years after the Montgomery bus boycott, and people have called me the mother of the modern civil rights movement. I feel very uncomfortable with that title, and I hope that by the time I share my story with you tonight, you will understand that this bus boycott happened because of the work of many, many people, of all backgrounds, rich and poor, black and white, and that was the wonder of it all. And people have also said that we were trying, and we continue with the civil rights movement, to destroy America. And no, It's quite the contrary. We are trying to save America, make America live up to its promise, its hope of freedom and democracy for all of its citizens. We all were raised to be patriotic. My goodness, we've served, my people, Negroes, have served in the defense of this country from the Civil War up through the Korean War. And now, unfortunately, in Vietnam. We've always been a patriotic people. We've always lived with the hope that America will live up to its promise. And that is why, in 1947, I insisted that the Freedom Train come to Montgomery, Alabama. In 1947, right after World War II, President Truman sent a train throughout the country for over 2 years to visit cities. This train carried the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and other important documents and artifacts. And they would stop in any city as long as they did not practice segregation with the exhibit. Now, we all, the NAACP, every civic organization, approached Montgomery and demanded that that train needed to come to us. And fortunately, there was no segregation in Montgomery when the train came. No separation of hours or days or times or lines. We all got to see the founding documents of this country together as American citizens. And I made sure I took my church youth group, I took my NAACP Youth Council, everyone. I wanted young people to know why we were so committed to this nation. I think Birmingham, Alabama was the only city that did not meet the requirements. But by the time I was 6 years old, I knew that I was not truly free. You see, that was the summer that has been called the Red Summer of 1919. All of our veterans were coming home from World War I, and all of our colored soldiers were beaten or maimed, sometimes killed for saying that they had defended their country, or even for just wearing their uniforms. White mobs would grab them off of streetcars and beat them until their anger or frustration was satisfied. And this kind of general violence led to an upsurge of the activity of the Ku Klux Klan. And they were running terror in my little town of Pine Level, Alabama. But my grandfather sat on our front porch at night with his shotgun across his lap because he said that he would kill the first one of those Kluxers who walked onto his property. And where was I during those nights? I was curled up at his feet on the porch. I wanted to be there no matter what happened. If he was going to shoot that gun, I wanted to see him shoot it. My grandfather modeled for me the importance of fighting for your dignity, for your home, for your family. I also learned the importance of that from my mother and my grandmother. They were good church-going women, but I grew up in the church, understanding that we're all children of God and that we deserve to be treated as such, that I could fight for my dignity. And so when I was just 6 years old and headed off to school for the first time. And I was walking along the sidewalk. A little white boy on roller skates was skating towards me. I didn't notice his mother, but I noticed him. He skated right up to me and shoved me off of the sidewalk. Well, I got right back up on the sidewalk and pushed him back. And his mother came over to me and said, "You push my son again like that and I'll push you so far back into jail you'll never get out." And I walked up to her and said, "He pushed me first." And I went on to school. When I got home that night, I told my mother and grandparents and my brother what I had done. I was very proud of myself. And that night, they went upstairs and packed my things and moved me over to our cousin's house. The Percivals lived on the other side of Pine Level. I stayed with them the rest of the school year during the school week, because from there I could walk to school and not have to walk through a white neighborhood. You see, I was always going to defend myself, no matter what Jim Crow said. Now, when I say Jim Crow, most people think that they were laws meant to separate the races, but they were more than that. They were meant to degrade us and strip us of our humanity and our sense of self, our identity. And they were not only laws, but they were customs that were enforced as if they were laws. And they differed from city to city, county to county, state to state. So you never really knew what you could do. It was a custom, not the law, that if white people were coming along the sidewalk, you were to step off and yield to them. Something I hadn't learned by the time I was 6 years old. I should have let that little boy skate on after he pushed me off and then gotten back on the sidewalk. You were not to shake hands with any white people. You were not to introduce yourself with your last name. And if white people broke any of those customs, then they were in trouble too. Their job, their family, their homes, sometimes their lives. We all, black and white, lived under the fear of Jim Crow. You know, I still felt it was important always to defend myself. Even as I went through high school, my grandmother would say, "Rosa Louise McCauley, you are going to be lynched by the time you get out of high school." But praise God, you see, I never was. You know, I was thrown off of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, long before that incident that started the bus boycott. Let me tell you how the buses worked, the Jim Crow buses worked in Montgomery. There were 36 seats on the bus. The first 10 were for whites only. The back seats, starting from the back towards the front, those 10 seats were for colored only. And it said so over the back window of the bus, colored only. Now, the 16 seats in between were called the mixed seats. We could sit there if we got there first, but if a white person needed a seat, we needed to give up that seat to the white person. If a white person sat down across the aisle from us, we had to get up and move back to the colored section because it was against the law to sit on the same row as a white person. The fare was 10 cents. If you were white, you got on and paid your 10 cents and sat at the front seats. If you were colored, you got on and paid your 10 cents at the front and got off the bus and then walked around to the back doors to get on. It was not unusual for it to be so crowded in the back. All you needed were a few white people scattered to the mixed seats, and all of us had to squeeze into the back part of the bus and stand on the stairwell to the doorway. And sometimes there wasn't enough room to get on. Sometimes the bus driver, not able to see, I assume the doors would shut. And people could get caught in the door, and the bus driver would drive on until we would scream and yell, and many of the white passengers as well, telling him to stop. Sometimes you would get off after paying your 10 cents, and as you were walking to the back doors, the doors would close and the driver would drive off with your ride and your 10 cents. Every bus driver carried a pistol, just to remind everyone that he was the law on that bus. And it depended on who your bus driver was, whether you were allowed to do certain things or not. The first time I remember being thrown off of a bus was in 1943. I was on my way to try to register to vote again. And I got on at the front, paid my 10 cents, and I looked to the back and I could see that I was going to have difficulty getting in the back doors. So I just turned and walked toward the back of the bus. And the bus driver said, "Where do you think you're going?" And I explained the situation. He said, "Not on my bus, you're not. Get off at the front. Get off!" Well, I was standing there kind of thinking, what do I do? When he got up and he came toward me and I said, "Do not strike me. I can get off on my own." So I walked toward the front of the bus and accidentally dropped my purse. And I sat down on one of the white seats to pick it up off the floor. And then I turned and looked at the bus driver, and I memorized his face. And I got off the bus. And I promised myself that I would never get on his bus again. And I didn't. For 12 years. But during those 12 years, I served as the secretary for the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. Now, this was not just taking minutes of the meeting and getting them approved. No. It meant that I scoured the papers every day for any incidents of police brutality or any mob violence. They would send me out to get affidavits, which were very difficult to get because people might share the story of what happened to them, but they were not willing to go to court and risk their lives or their families' lives or their home. And I could understand that. But we had to try. And I kept a record of everything that was going on. Every year I would write on behalf of the NAACP to Washington, to our representatives in Congress, asking them to pass a law against lynching. There were campaigns. I would write letters. This country still has not passed any law to stop that kind of murder. So I was very active in what was going on with the NAACP. Let me share with you what happened on that day that I was arrested. I worked at the Montgomery Fair department store in downtown Montgomery. I was a seamstress. You see, if you were white, you could shop in the store and try on the clothing you might want to buy. Negroes were not allowed to try on anything. But if you found as a white customer that the dress did not quite fit the way, or the suit the way you wanted it to fit, the tailor was called up and he would make marks and measurements and then send the clothing down to the basement where we seamstresses would make all the adjustments, and then you could come back the next day or so and get your perfectly tailored outfit. So it was December 1st, and things were starting to get busy at Montgomery Fair, but I wasn't particularly tired. But when I came out of the store that day, I could see that I wasn't going to get a seat on the bus. I maybe would not even be able to fit into the bus. So I crossed the street and went to Lee's Cut Rate to pick up a few things for the house. And as I was paying the cashier, I looked out the window and I could see there was the Cleveland Courts bus, the Cleveland Street bus there, and I would be able to get on. So I quickly got my change, ran across the street, paid my 10 cents, got off, and got onto the back and sat down in the mixed seats next to a gentleman. And we started talking, and it turns out his daughter was in my youth council, and I was preparing a workshop for them for that Saturday at Alabama State Teachers College. And so we had a lot to talk about. The bus went on for a few stops, and then the bus driver interrupted our conversation by saying, "Give me them seats." It got quiet on the bus, as it often does when something like that happens. "Make it light on yourselves and give me them seats." There was a white man standing. Well, this time the lady across the row from me stood up and moved to the back, and the gentleman I'd been talking to stood up, and I turned my legs to let him get by, and he moved to the back. And I slid over into his seat and looked out the window. And the bus driver got up and came back to my seat and said, "You gonna get up?" And I turned and said, "No." And that's when I realized it was the same bus driver that I had been avoiding for 12 years. "I'm going to have you arrested." And I said, "You may do that." And he had all the passengers get off the bus, and they were upset. You know, it was the end of the day. People wanted to get home. But I stayed in my seat until 2 officers came. And they said, "Why didn't you give up your seat when the bus driver asked you to?" And I said, "Why do you always push us around like this?" And he said, "I don't know, lady, it's the law. We've got to take you to jail." So they took my bags and took me to North Ripley Street Jail. And later that night, Parks, my husband, came. His name is Raymond Parks, but I always call him Parks. Parks came, and E.D. Nixon, the president of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, I had worked with him for 12 years as his secretary. He came and paid my bail along with Clifford Durr, a white attorney who was befriending our cause and worked often with the NAACP. And we all went back to our apartment, and all I wanted to do was to eat and go to bed. But they were meeting, and they asked me before I went to bed, Rosa, would you be willing to be the case that we try so that we can maybe change the segregation law on the buses? Well, how could I say no? I had spent 12 years of my life actively fighting for that, just that. So I agreed. Parks said, Rosa, they're going to kill you. He did not want me to do this. But I convinced him that it would be okay. And I went to bed, and the next day I went to work. And that lunch period on Friday, I would take my lunch every Friday and go to Fred Gray's office. He had come over for that meeting that night before in our little apartment. But when I got to his office to do typing for him, file some letters, answer the phone, the kind of thing I always did, his office was filled with people. The phone was ringing off the hook. They were making plans. You see, after they left our apartment, Fred Gray, one of our two Negro attorneys, had called Joanne Robinson, a professor at Alabama State University, which was the Negro university there in Montgomery. She had come from the North to teach there. And on her very first day of work, she was thrown off the bus because she was sitting in the wrong seat. She didn't know. But Joanne promised herself that she would do something about it. And she organized a boycott. But no one else wanted to boycott with her. So she sat patiently, waiting for the chance to do a boycott. It was the only way she could think to fight back. Well, Fred Gray had called Joanne, and she was, at that point, the president of the Women's Political Council. She said, Fred, does this mean that we're going to try the boycott? And he said, yes. So it was that night, Thursday night, she went to her office at school and typed up a flyer and printed off thousands and thousands of copies on a mimeograph machine, called her students, had them come to distribute the flyer throughout all of the Negro neighborhoods, to the schools, to the churches, so that everyone we could think of would know that. And this is what the flyer said. In brief, it's paraphrased, but another Negro woman has been arrested for breaking the segregation laws on our buses. Her case comes to court on Monday, December 6th. We are asking everyone to not ride the buses on Monday. We couldn't say boycott the buses because there's a law in Alabama against boycotting anything. We're asking people to not ride the buses that day, to walk if you must go to work or if you must go shopping, walk to school or find a ride, but please do not ride the buses. Well, E.D. Nixon had contacted someone he knew at the Montgomery Advertiser, the paper, and little did Joe Asbell know that when he submitted that information that Negroes were not going to ride the buses on Monday because of Mrs. Rosa Parks' case, the editor decided to put it on the front page of the paper. So everyone knew, white and black, we were not supposed to ride the buses. Well, that morning, the bus driver got into their buses and drove to their bus stops, which were packed with Negroes waiting, because we had been told that that is where you could wait for a ride. Anyone who had a car, all of the Negro taxi drivers were going to pick up passengers there and take them on to work or to school. And the bus drivers would come up to the bus stop, open the door, and expect all those passengers to get on. And they all started chanting, "No riders here. No riders here." Louder and louder until the bus driver would close the door and move on, and was greeted with the same welcome at every bus stop. We all met that night at the Holt Street Baptist Church, as we were instructed to do, and the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association, with its new president, Martin Luther King Jr., the new preacher in town, informed everyone and thanked everyone for not riding the buses, and asked, would you like to continue to not ride the buses, and ask for some changes? And everyone said yes. And the changes we asked for was that Negro riders would be treated with respect, that we had the same segregation laws as they do in Mobile, Alabama, where the mixed seats were first comes, first served. You could keep your seat no matter your race. And we asked that they hire some Negro bus drivers to drive the routes in our neighborhoods. We did not ask for an end to segregation. But the city would not hear of it. They would not negotiate with us, and we would not go back to riding the buses. It was a very slim Christmas that year, but we persisted in walking and walking, even though many lost their jobs. By the end of January, we were getting tired. And Bob Gretz, a white Lutheran pastor who was leading an all-Negro Lutheran church, contacted the New York Times and said, I know you're reporting on this boycott, but you're not getting the full story. You need to come down here and see what's going on. And so the media came, and they reported on what we were doing. And they are the ones who dubbed us Montgomery, the walking city. And money started coming in. We were running on a shoestring our own transportation system with dispatchers and station wagons and cars, and we were running it from 5 a.m. until after midnight. But now we had money to buy more cars, to insure our cars, to buy gas. We had money to help people who had lost their work. Shoes were being sent, and we could distribute shoes because shoes were wearing out. It was a new energy among the people in Montgomery. But the thing that turned the tide was at the end of January, they bombed Martin Luther King Jr.'s house. No one was hurt or killed. No. But that night, the NAACP attorneys met and they decided to make a new case with different women who had been arrested. You see, my case, it had gotten bogged down in the Alabama court system. And this new case was taken directly to the federal district court. And they found in our favor, and it was appealed and on up to the Supreme Court of the United States, when they decided in November that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. Well, thank you. Thank you. On December 21st, we met at the same way we had been meeting throughout the boycott. And we were told that the next day we could ride the buses. Well, you would think that we would have cheered, that we would have run out into the streets singing and dancing hallelujah. But no, there were prayers, there was crying. I'll never forget the sight of grown men, their backs just heaving with the sobs. It had been so long, and we had struggled, not only through that year, but for decades before. They told us we could ride the buses if we made sure that we did not sit next to a white person on purpose and gloat or boast. And if any person were to hit us or beat us or spit on us or push us off the bus, we were to behave as we had throughout the entire boycott. We were not to retaliate in any way. And if we could not do those two things, we should wait until we could, and then go back to riding the buses. Well, the next day, all of the media was in Montgomery, Alabama, and they were downtown to get pictures of Doctors Martin Luther King and Reverend Abernathy riding on integrated buses. And someone must have said, what about that Rosa Parks who started all this? So they came out to our apartment, and when they asked if they could take a picture, I said, no, I don't want any more notoriety. I'm glad it's over. Please leave me alone. But they convinced me that I should do this last thing. So I put on my hat and my gloves and my coat, and I went downstairs, and we waited at the bus stop for the first bus. The photographer and his assistant. And when the bus came, it was empty. But the photographer said, Miss Parks, we need this picture. He had me get on and sit in the front seat, and he had his assistant sit behind me. And he said, I want you next to the window, looking out the window the way you did that day. And so he took that picture. And I got off the bus and went back to our apartment. And don't you know that that was the picture they chose for the cover of Look magazine? And don't you know, this is something only God could have brought to be. The bus driver on the bus that day was the same one who had me arrested. Well, I've shared my story, and you may have some questions or comments that you want to make. Believe me, there's so much more to share about it, but I want to hear from you. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, this young man. What's my favorite animal? No, I've never been able to have a pet. And I think if I were to have a pet, that I would prefer a cat. Something nice and quiet that would sit on my lap and not cause any trouble. Yes.
Miss Parks, we have a quick little question over
Oh,
here.
okay.
I actually have 5 questions.
How about one?
You have 5?
2?
What's your best?
2? Okay, 1. Did you like going barefoot as a kid?
Oh, yes, I did. And unfortunately, I had to go barefoot because we didn't have shoes when we were still living in Pine Level. And at that point, I was still working in cotton fields and picking cotton.
My question is, did you like it?
Did I like it? Not in the cotton field. But I did enjoy and kept going barefoot when I was a child at home in Montgomery.
1 more.
Okay.
Do you believe in dragons?
Do I believe in dragons? Only when I'm reading stories about dragons.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How was your life different after this?
How was your life different after this?
After the boycott?
Yes.
Well, I did not have ulcers before. I developed ulcers during the boycott, and I'm still dealing with those. So it affected my health. And at this point, after the boycott, no one would hire me. I had a hard time making a living, as did my husband, Parks. And so we moved to Detroit about a year after the boycott. No, it was sooner than that. It was 50, 56, 57 in the spring. And so we moved to Detroit, and I worked in a shirt factory as a seamstress. But now I work for Representative John Conyers in his Detroit office. And so the kind of work I'm doing, it's still similar to what I did as a volunteer for the NAACP in Montgomery. But I work in his congressional office in Detroit. And so I finally feel safe and that I'm still contributing to the cause. However, Detroit was the promised land that wasn't. I could ride buses, I could shop, but it was not the promised land. There was still a lot of racism there.
Got a question right down here.
So you were very involved with the NAACP before you sat on the bus. Did you have any training in civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience, before you refused to get off the bus?
The only experience I had with that was at the Highlander Folk School in Montego, Tennessee. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was established at the beginning of the labor movement, and they had been involved in training of grassroots movements, and they shifted from labor to civil rights. And there I had some fabulous instructors who were doing grassroots work, and they gave us the training. Other people who've attended there, not while I was there, but Martin Luther King attended there, Julian Bond attended there. I see someone else has comments, but it was a fertile ground for us to learn. And we were learning. Septima Clark was a Negro who had done schools in South Carolina to teach illiterate male Negroes, how to pass the tests so they could vote. And she was my instructor there.
Got a question. Can you describe the atmosphere in the Baptist church those days when the boycott was getting started in Dr. King's church? What was the atmosphere like?
We met twice a week for the boycott at the Holt Street Baptist Church, our largest church, and the Dexter Street Baptist Church. it was the only place where we could hear from our leadership the truth of what was actually happening. And it was like a worship service. A large part of it was like a worship service. There was singing and a community. There were several clubs that were started. The Friendly Club and the Club Out of Nowhere. There were clubs of women who were raising money. It was energetic and enthusiastic. And if we had not had those worship services, I do not think that we could have made it through the year. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. Is there a microphone?
When you were diagnosed with dementia, how did you?
I do not have dementia,
Yeah,
so I'm
dementia.
sorry. I think there's someone you can talk to later about that. I have ulcers, but no dementia. I'm still working at Reverend Conyers, Representative Conyers' office. If there aren't any more questions, then I guess we can call it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your
Thank you, Mrs. Parks. And now let's take this opportunity to introduce you to the scholar behind the portrayal of Mrs. Parks, Becky Stone. Becky Stone. A little bit about Becky. Becky holds degrees from Vassar College and Villanova University, and she has been a Chautauquan since 2003, portraying multiple historical figures, including Harriet Tubman, Maya Angelou, Josephine Baker. She's an accomplished storyteller and joins us from North Carolina.
Yes.
Yes. So we've got the warm weather just to kind of welcome you here that way. Becky portrayed Rosa Parks in the 50s in Focus Chautauqua from 2019 to 2022. And she will be rejoining us on stage just a little bit later to ask more questions from the perspective of her about the character and so forth. So we'll look forward to returning you to the stage here shortly.